So, welcome to Uninformed Summary, a podcast where four friends with varied levels of research into a topic discuss that topic and how it relates to history in one way or the other. This week's topic is George Carlin, and I'm in the hot seat. My name is Vinny. I've done the most research here, books and comic bits, and way too many late nights listening to stand up. Underneath me in research levels is Mike. Say hi, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Mike, what have you done for research?
I have watched a couple of his stand-up bits, and I've read the Wikipedia page about 2 hours or so.
Cool. After that is Scott. Say hi, Scott.
Hello.
Scott has done even less research than Mike. What did you do for research on George Carlin?
Watched a couple of YouTube videos. Luckily, I already have, being in the stand-up circuit, know a little bit about George Carlin and how he relates to history. But then on top of that, I watched other comedians talk about George Carlin.
I'm going to count that as cheating, but we'll address that later. And then lastly, we have Matt. Matt, say hi.
Hi.
And Matt, how much research have you done on George Carlin before this episode?
1999, I watched the movie Dogma.
I think he was the
Cardinal
shit monster
Glick.
in that movie.
He was not the Gold Coast that he was talking about.
And yeah, that movie, definitely a later bit, such a background in his life. We're going to catch up, but his historical impact is actually the FCC versus Pacifica Supreme Court case. We will get there, but we have to begin at the beginning, as they say. So let's talk about George Carlin. Full name, George Dennis Patrick Carlin.
Much shorter than our previous topic.
Yeah, definitely. Emperors have longer names, comics not so much. But Carlin is born in New York City's. I'm sorry. It's Morningside Heights, this little borough of New York City, in 1930 on May 12th, to an advertising salesman of a dad who drinks a lot, and a very hardworking executive secretary mother, who's also very, very hardworking. And they're hard at work raising their 5-year-old, which is George Carlin's little older brother, Patrick Jr., when George is born. And it's the perfect time for him to be born because the family's falling apart due to his dad's alcoholism, which is hilarious. Maybe not so much, but that family problem of alcoholism was both pervasive and foundational in George's upbringing. He was one of those kids in the neighborhood without the male father figure around, and a lot of times that caused trouble. So it wasn't long before he was landed in a Catholic school, Corpus Christi, actually, a famously progressive New York City Catholic school, where a lot of the nuns who educated George, little George Carlin, gave him some freedoms in the classroom that might have been the beginnings of what, he sort of used as a performatory streak. He'd be a big class clown, and they would kind of lean into it to the point where it got too dirty and then discipline him, but they kind of encouraged him throughout
I went
be
to Catholic
himself.
schools. They don't appreciate that.
This is the weirdest Catholic school I've ever heard of.
famously progressive. Yeah,
It
Corpus
said
Christi.
progressive and Catholic in the same sentence, and it kind of blew my mind.
Liberal might be
Especially
another way to put it.
Because you're talking in like the late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, right. But here's the thing. He had this amazing grasp of language as a mostly self-taught kid. That language teaching that he gave himself kind of came from book learning at home, but more so the radio. So his parents, whoever was there, his mom or caretaker, would pop on the radio, and he would listen to these radio DJs, and that is how he got a substantial amount of his vocabulary and his bits and his love of the performer. This sort of radio DJ was the center of attention, and he latched onto that, actually, so much so that one of his favorite childhood gifts was a tape recorder that his mom bought him when he had turned 13 and graduated 8th grade.
You made it, kid. You're in the real
Yeah.
world now.
Yeah, but when in that older time frame, I wonder how much it would have cost to. I probably should have looked that up, but I bet it was a substantial investment to get a tape
Wait.
recorder in like the 50s or 60s, before then. But she did it. She saved up
1915.
and got it for him. Um, Interestingly enough, he would use it to cut fake commercials and comic bits and stuff and find his little voice there. But he would also write, poetry and plays. He had to write a play for his reform school to graduate to get that tape recorder, actually. Um, they couldn't kick him out, even though he tried to sell fake heroin on like the first day of reform school. He really
Since high
did.
school, like heroin.
No, he shot. They were interviewing his brother in a documentary. A&E's did a documentary about him that aired in 2002, and they were interviewing his brother, who claimed that George had chopped up little bits of like pencil erasers and rubbed them up against like other substances and told the kids that he was trying to sell them to that it was black tar heroin. With his 13-year-old gravelly comic voice, but
I was about ready to say, I imagine Carlin at 13 had the Carlin rasp.
maybe not the rasp, but he had a raspy sort of street kid upbringing, that led him to want to be the center of attention. But more importantly, that cut his teeth and, gave him the skills to do that. So by the time he's 15, he drops out of high school, though. The year he turned 16. And then he joined the early enrollment for the Air Force when he was 17. He's like trying to let maybe the military work it out. A lot of wayward kids, a lot of wayward dreams get formed into, like, he was trying to appease his mom to some way of becoming a stand-up individual, not a stand-up comic, like an actual citizen that she would approve of. But it was not going well. And he had a plan to marry his high school sweetheart throughout the Air Force bit. It did not work out as well either. And he also didn't enjoy the military life, if you can imagine that. A boisterous kid who didn't like being told what to do.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be a big crux of his comedy, is his anti-authoritism, which I think is a word.
Authoritism.
Yeah.
Oh, it's weird though. Wasn't Lenny Bruce a big influence of his?
Mm-hmm.
He was in the military too.
Yes.
Also got out because he didn't gel with him, unsurprisingly.
Was Carlin really in the military? I mean, he did the DJ thing, right?
He did the DJ thing as an off-base job, but he was in the military. He worked on radars in the military.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I remember reading that now.
Yeah, from the Air Force, he had an affinity for that technological bit, but might have influenced some of the radio DJ work he was using. He was using some cutting-edge equipment in both jobs. But he was really only applying himself to the one job. You guys could probably guess which one. He did not enjoy his military job. He way enjoyed the DJ life. And in 1957, he's 20 years old, and at his job, he mocks his superior officer, a man with potentially, if you read a certain source or another, has a neurological condition that makes him do this. Or sometimes they just say he's an anxious guy, but he shook, like, shaky. So he had a nickname on base of Shaky. And they knew they listened into George's radio work. So George put on the track Elvis Presley's All Shook Up while he dedicated the song to his commanding officer. And this was kind of the last straw after a short career in the Air Force. And they finally wrapped his discharge by, it says here, the reasons included failing to appear for guard duty, driving while intoxicated, disrespect to air policemen, failure to obey a lawful order by an air policeman, and disobeying a direct order from an officer. And that was sort of just part of the rap sheet. It did include some more non-court martialable offenses, which he had 3.
Yeah, 3 court martials. That's what I say. I remember reading that.
Jeez.
Yeah, and he's 20 by now, so already sort of eventful life. But he's out of the military now, right? He gets kicked out, and throughout this period in time, he's kind of shuffling himself around the country looking for jobs, gig to gig, and radio. Ends up in Boston, where that doesn't last long either, because he got fired for stealing the company van of the radio station and going on a drug run across state lines.
Now, I
Yeah,
have no idea how we're gonna get there, but this fine upstanding citizen had a Supreme Court case.
yeah. Well, he
He was the defendant, right?
Yeah.
no. Luckily, he didn't have to present. He was never actually there.
Seriously.
probably-
Judge Carlin presiding.
But it wasn't that Supreme Court case that comes later. It definitely wasn't the first time his bits had to be read onto the record, which is interesting. But he ends up in Texas in 59, and an old friends call into him, this guy named Jack Burns, who's another radio DJ and comic type out of Boston. And Burns and Carlin meet, and they become, an act, using their two minds to work together and build an act, and they move to Hollywood, getting popular while they do so. They get a radio morning show, and in 1960, 13 years before he's going to make history here, he is in Hollywood, right? I mean, for all intents and purposes, that's like making it, isn't it?
Yeah, especially back then, because there wasn't like a competitive scene anywhere. Like you have East Coast comics and West Coast comics now. It's, from my understanding, is that if you were going to do anything of substance, it had to be in that California circuit.
Right, because that's where a lot of your radio and TV was produced, at least
Exactly.
nationwide.
Exactly.
That was your exposure, was getting anything on any type of broadcasts out of Hollywood.
And that's changed a bit now, but for a long, I mean, even after that, the biggest competitor was like East Coast New York area,
Yeah, with the club scene and all that.
Exactly.
As far as comedy goes, you mean like stand-up comedy performances? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now you have like YouTube and things that, I mean, they have crazy amounts of exposure now compared to the 1960s.
Hollywood was the place to be for George and for Burns, his partner. They had a lot of success with their radio show, which is called the Wright Brothers. Spelled like the Dayton, Ohio Wright Brothers. Same. Like, yeah. Their show was popular. It was full of bits, kind of had the same, hey, it's wacky in the George Carlin morning DJ show. But it also explored some pretty taboo subject matter. Imagine that. Carlin was not about to let go of his penchant for being bristly and offensive. And he did a really good job of that, while Burns was more appealing to the clean, the, sort of, if comedy had a shaved face and dapper hair, that might be more Burns' delivery. But they were very, very perfect for each other, great foils. Lenny Bruce found out about him. And to Matt's point earlier, like, they did become friends through this process where Bruce and Burns and Carlin and other performers got mixed in with each other's acts, got to know each other. And Bruce's manager took an interest in Carlin and Burns, and not that long after they start playing around Hollywood, they get an album recorded. It's Burns and Carlin at the Playboy Club Tonight. It's the first Burns and Carlin comedy album they're going to record. It's 1960. And they never actually recorded at the Playboy Club, but they just called it that.
Why not?
But
Man, the cover of that album.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now.
It's a great cover. It's a great cover. And this was a diversion from some of the stand-up comedy at the time. They had some sick beat, like offbeat stuff, bits about like pedophilia and World War II being horribly grim, and racism, heroin use, domestic violence. But here's where some of this thread of like the FCC case, obscene versus indecent speech, starts to come in. They never swore. They wouldn't use those 7 words, right? In their whole album. They had a bit called Killer Carlin in this album, Jack and Burns. Did you guys encounter Killer Carlin in your research?
The name sounds familiar.
Yeah, I did not.
So Carlin's bit, Killer Carlin, it's about a boxer, and he's talking about his rise to fame and how he had to train so hard from humble beginnings, right? And he's like, oh yeah, we had to definitely work hard, but we didn't have a lot of money, so mom had to become our training partner. but it got hard because she kept falling out of the wheelchair every time I hit her with a right. And these horrible, right, morbid,
In the 1960s, when you have like Don Knotts going, oh,
right.
Right.
that was your comedy.
And though you also have Lenny Bruce at the same time in the late 50s doing
Yep.
these midnight shows, musing for 15 minutes on the word shit and like scatological humor, pushing those boundaries. So these multiple worlds of comedy kind of existing, one on the cleaner cut side and one on the he's like dangerous artistic side. Burns and Carlin hit the middle pretty nicely. And they enjoyed that fame for a while, and it actually brought George into meeting in the same year Brenda Hosbrook in the city of Dayton, Ohio, in a comedy club. Did a show there in August of 1960 where he met Brenda. She was working at the bar, or the club rather, and they formed a great instant sort of friendship. Went to her house that night, and the rest became history, etc. But this relationship was really important to him because Brenda kind of acted as the rock that George didn't really have. The only really consistent relationship in his life might have been his mom, and then here comes Brenda to ground him when he was trying, so hard to find a reason to be that way. So it was a really interesting relationship that formed. And Dayton, Ohio, hey, right?
Right.
What?
Yeah.
For the viewers, that's where we're primarily located. So
Yeah, it's a very local feel. And I never got the name of the comedy club, which was sad, despite despite reading and stuff. They reference the city, but they don't reference the name of the club he played that night or
Probably
where
doesn't
she was
exist
working.
anymore.
It might be gone, lost to time. But then there's other developments in his career. In '62, Burns and Carlin break up. It's a very professional breakup, amicable. Like Jack Burns gave Carlin the rights to the album, the Playboy Club album, so that he's like, yeah, you can have an album of your own to call your own, and you can use this to establish your career because Jack Burns was getting famous in the other way, the sort of cleaner cut way, which is really cool. Like found that on the Wikipedia, found that was a really, I thought you hear breakup in professional
Yeah, they're always
circles.
messy. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
super
Right, yeah,
wholesome.
but the fact that they stayed friends and everything.
I will say I was able to find where he met his wife. It was at what is called the Dayton Racket Club, which has been since then renamed to the Dayton Club, which is permanently closed.
Ooh.
I think but it still exists. I think is it just closed because COVID?
The building itself still exists, yeah, but it says it's marked down as permanently closed. I believe it's now a health center. It's just a fun little fact.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's for those of us who stomp around Dayton, Ohio. That's he also, fun fact about Dayton, he crashed his car into a telephone pole there later in life while having a cardiac event.
Jeez.
Yeah, well, he lived back and forth between Dayton and Toronto and Dayton and New York. Actually, he spent a lot of time in the city.
Interesting. I wonder what it was about. I mean, was that after he met his wife or before?
It'd be after. He was probably playing
Okay.
through Dayton.
Makes
Dayton's
sense.
part of that coast to coast roadway system, the national road, and
It's
the
true.
railways and stuff. Yeah, this
Crossroad
is the
of
60s
America.
too. That's right. So he was definitely on 40 and 48, but meeting Brenda and having that relationship was a stabilizing force in his life while he was skyrocketing to some pretty notable fame. And then June 1963 comes, and George Carlin be fucking because he and his wife Brenda gave birth to Kelly Carlin, who's their daughter.
One other fun fact about Brenda, his wife, I just read looking into that other research, is that she used to pick him up and drive him to work, Lenny Bruce.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it says that sometimes he would be staying at a hotel nearby, so she'd go and pick him up.
Well, which makes sense because they would work together too. And at this point, Carlin is in the club that Lenny Bruce gets arrested in 1962 for an obscene language event. He's doing a bit on scatological and swearing and all this stuff and being obscene, which is one of those kind of key terms here. But he gets arrested off stage, right? As soon as he's finished. They break up the performance and they arrest Lenny Bruce, and they're questioning people in the audience that night. And they end up questioning George Carlin, who, for the same in the same night, goes to jail, but for a different reason. Carlin says, basically, I'm not going to give you a government ID to the cop asking. He's like, I don't believe in government IDs. So the cop just arrests him and puts him in the same car as Lenny Bruce, this absolutely, avant-garde, obscene comic. And they remain fast friends through this period as well. Later on, Carlin would get his first arrest for obscenity, kind of wearing that Bruce mantle. In 1969, he got arrested in Las Vegas at the Frontier Hotel. He was experimenting with, rough swearing material, and same deal. As soon as he finished his set, they arrested him, breaking up the show, and that was kind of a mantle he began to carry after Bruce. So we're moving through like the decades of Carlin's rise, right? So 1970 now. He's a few years into his career that is now kind of shot into more fame, but he's having a hard time. He's struggling with the social issues of the time, right? The 60s, despite with the advertising, were not the most peaceful of times. And the late 60s definitely a part of that. The decade turned over into civil rights problems, persistent Vietnam War concerns, social issues, the hippies, and all these things started to impact George Carlin. And if you guys looked at the pictures of him between the 60s and the 70s, there's just this bloom, like psychedelic bloom of Carlin, who just embraces the counterculture after long enough. He quit cutting his hair. He quit wearing suits. He started, getting long sleeve tees like baseball shirts, and grew a ponytail, and started to really go against the grain of professional comedy to his benefit.
Also, he started wearing earrings and things. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, this was extremely counterculture, or seen as such, right? Growing your hair back then was a political statement.
It just blows my mind, like only 70 years ago, like not wearing a suit was like something controversial. The gall to not wear
His cufflinks don't match.
What the hell, man? Like, come on.
Yeah,
Trying to
they're
have a
fine with
society here.
You can smoke cigarettes in the job interview, but not if you're underdressed. You'll lose it automatically.
Right.
And you could broadcast and say, but some of the things they could say or do were just kind of like that Killer Carlin bit, but there was no law against sort of bigotry on TV, or talking
Abuse.
about smacking a woman was certainly not a problem on your broadcast.
Well, I mean, right around that same time, you had the Honeymooners, and the famous line is, "One of these days, pow, straight to the moon."
Implication of domestic abuse, and that's cool. And these are the things that Carlin's hitting on. These are his gripes turned into comedy bits, and he's working on a really special one called Filthy Words. He's been playing with this kind of humor his whole life, and now he's putting it into the professional. By then he's already recorded a few comedy albums, but this one that we're going to talk about is Class Clown. So it's 1972. He's been arrested a couple times. He's definitely gained fame and acclaim. And Class Clown comes out with the 7 words you can't say on TV bit. When he recorded it in front of a live audience, it slayed, but it's kind of like the shit heard around the world. It's his formative, kind of up to this point, finished piece where he reveals those 7 words: shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. And it's an incredible, like, play on society's empowerment of these words. He starts the bit by saying 400,000 words in the English language, and 7 of them you can't say on TV. And he kind of goes into that ratio. It's insane. And the bit itself kills and gets very popular, and the album's very popular as well. Um, and that is where he starts to like really get involved with this making history thing. Because in 1973, a radio station picks that album up that is sponsored by, or sorry, is affiliated from the Pacifica Foundation. This, like George himself, is kind of a different brand of broadcasting where they are listener supported. You know, on the NPR, it's like, we're
Yeah.
supported by listeners like you. Thank you. Also, like Pacifica Foundation is kind of one of the first entities doing this. They've been around, the foundation's been around for some time, and they've already built up a weird reputation for being controversial because they're funded by listeners, right?
Have
No,
to
they're
worry
not.
about sponsors and stuff.
Yes, they're not funded by the same professional advertisers, the guys like George Carlin's dad, who would make you, who would be fine with slapping a woman, but wouldn't be okay with talking about the Vietnam War in a negative way on the air. So that's the kind of dichotomy that we're seeing here in broadcasting. Now, at this point, in 73, WBAI, which is a New York radio station affiliated, like I said, from Pacifica, they play this lunch pail is the name of the broadcast, and on that they play George Carlin's bit "Filthy Words" from his album.
But he says in the album you can't say it.
He says that you can't say it. The radio station did a fair job of warning everybody. They did. They did. The host was Paul Gorman, and he was already known for having a scandalous kind of reputation, or brave maybe. But he would say, look, this is a really serious topic. It's about examination of language in society, and it's on at 2 p.m. So, you know, if you're not into it, you need to kind of turn it off, or for the next 15 minutes, just turn this off and walk away. And that's part of the broadcast that WBAI put out. But still, you know, if everybody listened to warnings. So here's where it gets historical. This day, October 30th, 1973, the broadcast goes out, and a man named John H. Douglas is listening to it in his car with his tween-age son. Accounts put it at 12 to 15, depending on who you are. Which, by the way, sidebar, if I'm 12 to 15 and you turn on the Star Wars war, shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, these words go, I'd be jazzed. So the kid's probably having a great time, you know, feeling like he's getting away with something. And then John H. Douglas is furious. He's like, what are you doing, Pacifica Foundation and WBAI Radio? How dare you? And goes home and writes.
That guy had a flat top, right? He had.
I send you $2 a month, and this is the filth you put on air.
He was wearing a suit and he had a flat top haircut. I guarantee it.
That's a for sure. That's a for sure. Maybe those really.
His son probably called him Major instead of Dad.
What is this Bolshevism?
He sized his shirts intentionally too small around the collar, and like he had that like dip of skin over the collar. But like those kind of guys. He and his friends, John H. Douglas, were part of a group called Morality in Media.
Oh God.
Yeah, so it's not like some rando just got on the phone and complained. He's a minister, guys, and he's a planning board member for a notably pro-censorship public policy group, Morality in Media. So that's probably not the right person to stumble onto your dirty word stash. And he just writes this scathing letter to the FCC, and he's like, "Hey, it's 1973. How can you guys do this? I thought we were evolved citizens, and you know, I know you guys punish radio stations for being sexual or suggestive or inflammatory or seditious. So these guys ought to lose their fucking license. I'm so mad." You know, and he's like, "My kid heard that," and I can pretty much picture his kid in the background, just like, "Yeah."
His kid's trying to convince the neighbor to buy the album for him.
Yeah, just doing what we did, like go in there with your oldest looking friend with a mustache.
Part his hair off to the side. Yes, I'd like to purchase 3 albums, please.
There's a lot of interesting dichotomy though in this time in society. In 73, you could like Lyndon Baines Johnson's commission on obscenities was happening at this time, and like
Man,
this
the
group,
70s really did not like dirty words, did they?
they didn't know how to feel about him yet. I think that was what they were struggling with. And Carlin did a fantastic job at poking directly through the veil of euphemism, of saying like, "Oh my God, you guys spend so much more time considering the dirtiness of the word than if you would just say the thing." That seems to be one of his main thrusts. And they're trying to decide on a social level in this country at this time, like, is porn okay? Can we let adults watch pornography? So John H. Douglas's group, Morality and Media, says no, and they're part of decisions like that in public policy. That's their job, to basically lobby the government, right? So they use that influence to have the FCC sanction WBAI with a penalty. So like they were going to say, normally it'd be a fine, right? If you guys like familiar with that idea, if you say too many swears on the radio, well, this isn't a fine. They say this time we're not going to let you renew your license.
Man.
Yeah. For 7 dirty words. The idea, but even though they were warned, even though the station is known for being, educational, informative, and all this other thing, doesn't matter. Not going to let you renew your license because you played this product. So naturally, WBAI takes this case. And one of the sources I was reading is James Sullivan. It's called The Life and Crimes of George Carlin. Talks about the background of the Supreme Court and what kind of cases it was hearing, what kind of cases other courts were hearing right now. So like indecent language, obscene language. Did you guys know in LA in the 1960s and 70s you could go to jail for coming to court in a jacket that said "fuck the draft"?
Wow.
Did you know that that would make it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court in 71? Because this case happened prior, but they had to make that kind of decision at the U.S. Supreme Court level to reverse an LA court decision that basically had a man arrested for this expression. So this is in the background. There's like the Hill Link Minority Report in the background, like I referenced before. Lyndon Baines Johnson, the Commission on Obscenity. All test casing for this is the perfect one. Carlin's 7 dirty words is like the perfect test case for seeing if the FCC can put a grasp on broadcasting like this. Like, imagine, man. Imagine now if you turned on the radio at 2 p.m. and heard that language.
Still
Could you
can,
guys?
right?
Yeah, could you?
I don't think so, right?
Well, from my understanding, it would be you definitely can't hear it on television, radio, those kind of things. I mean, that's a big reason why XM and Sirius came into like such popularity, was that it was able to bypass those FCC type of things for being like a paid subscription service. But yeah, even now, like if you watch anything on television that's before 9 p.m. and it's not on it's on any sort of public channel. I mean, there is so much that they can't do it. There's so much alliteration to certain things happening or certain words.
Yeah, you couldn't.
Cable got around that too, right?
Cable was like the get around because before
Right.
cable, and we'll kind of probably touch on that, like HBO, Carlin's pretty instrumental in that too. But before cable, it's all broadcast. It's all FCC, everything under the sun. It's 2 p.m. You can't say Carlin's 7 dirty words. You can't say cheat, Ryan, snot. You couldn't say angry fart. You mother. You couldn't say strangling. Nothing like that.
Jesus, Vinny.
Well,
I'm just saying what you couldn't say. I'm just saying what you couldn't say.
That is.
Wait, what about when we go to or that the dad or even
I am clearly friends with a bunch of dirty people.
You could probably say if you weren't at church.
I'm about to call the FCC now.
But this should have been fined in 1973. That was the current that kind of behavior would have been fined, but they went a step farther with the WBAI case, and particularly because Carlin was known at this time. This was a big opportunity for a government commission to assert some power here, and they did just that. They took this case all the way up to the DC Circuit Appeals Court, which, if I'm familiar, is like right below Supreme Court. But DC says, actually, hey, actually, they say, FCC, you've gone too far. Carlin and his nasty words are okay. They're indecent. They're not obscene, right? I should probably take a second here to establish like what the criteria were. Yeah, like there was criteria for what was obscene or indecent, and that made a big difference.
Please
Right.
tell me it was just like a piece of paper that just had like these are the words you can't say, and that's on a document somewhere at the FCC.
Obscene is like sex stuff, right?
They had a very, specifically this. Obscene speech was really attending to the prurient, that's a tough word to say, interest, basically meaning sexual or pornographic or scatological, right? And then the second of these three criteria at the time is they were patently offensive, meant to offend, right? Not just meant to provoke, but or rather provoke thought, but just to be mean and dirty. And the third criteria was they had, get this, no redeeming social value.
And what's funny at this point in time, like things like racial slurs probably didn't fall under that.
The
Oh,
N-word
for sure
was
not.
not part of that in every context.
Well,
you
yeah,
could say it in certain places.
Yeah, because they actually would say it on that. Well, I forget the name of the show, but the I remember watching it. It'd be on Nick at Night. My mom would have me watch this show where this guy sat on a couch and just called his neighbor the N-word.
Archie
terrible.
Bunker.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you, dude. It's bothered me. I couldn't get that right away, but yeah, I remember watching that on TV, probably somewhere around 2 p.m.
A
All
large,
in the
a lar-
family.
a large
Mhm.
portion of that show's humor was from racism. Like
Yes.
people have called him like America's funniest racist or funniest bigot. Like, yeah.
Yeah, bigotry, it was not part of this FCC wide-reaching or I should say deep diving, censorship effort. It wasn't smoking. It wasn't beating your kids. These things were not part of the problem. It was those 7 words. And that's why Carlin's bit was so instrumental in the case, because it really had to be hammered out on the anvil to see if they could see if the FCC could really push that influence onto speech. And guys, I have bad news. Because these cases from 1973 when the complaint is filed until 1978 when it is finally heard after DC Circuit reverses FCC, it goes to the Supreme Court, and that's in April. Takes a few months to deliberate, and then July of 1978 they come out with the verdict, and it's 5-4, and it's not good for Carlin. And the FCC is empowered by this 5-4 decision, the majority siding with the right to regulate indecent speech. However, they made a good conceit that the speech was not obscene, which is awesome. Let's take a moment. This is Supreme Court. There's a stenographer. Somebody has
Yes.
to get up.
I was literally just thinking that as you have these 9 white guys going, well, why can't you say cunt?
I think we've all thrown around a cocksucker.
Yeah, I mean, come on. And it took
But
a
not on the
month to
radio.
deliberate it,
Not on the radio. I mean, come on.
To Matt's point, yes, to Matt's point, not on the radio, and not at 2 p.m. I heard that referenced too. I mean, these were so
Somebody think of the children.
It
The
wasn't
teeth-
9 white guys. It was 8 white guys and a black guy.
Yeah.
Thurgood
I
Marshall
gotcha.
was sitting.
Thurgood Marshall is on the Supreme Court.
My apologies.
I believe he was in the dissenting opinion, which both were passionate here. The 5-4 ruling was a really split decision, and it definitely represented a lot of how everyday folks felt. The Carlin audience definitely sympathized, but the dissenting opinion was basically this: hey man, didn't we just hear that one case about the draft jacket and we let him go? He's fine. But Carlin's a no, and the majority opinion rebuts and wins the case, right? So they're like, well, but it's 2 p.m. and there's kids listening, and they could have been at home. So this case sets an interesting precedent, which works against Carlin's writing of the piece in the first place. It's kind of a sad day in that respect, right? They say the FCC is allowed to regulate this indecent speech through these hours of the day, and it creates the foundation of what is now the safe harbor laws. Remember how earlier you said you couldn't imagine hearing these words at 2 p.m.? It's because of this Supreme Court case and the relevant actions that followed. It just put a freeze on that kind of behavior on TV and radio.
So now the FCC regulates that, but that's why pay channels and things like HBO and stuff can circumvent it because it's no longer available to the public.
Correct. And at the same time, you have FCC sanctioned programming like Saturday Night Live forming in the 70s. Interestingly, George Carlin, first episode of Saturday Night Live, first host. Really, really interesting, pushing boundaries, right? But they have to work within these insinuations and limits. HBO comes around a few years after this case, and it really gives Carlin a break, and it really gives Carlin a chance to express himself in his sets.
I was going to say, HBO was right there in like 77, 76, somewhere in there is when it came out, if I remember.
Yep. Yeah, he was also pioneer on HBO. They sought him out, right? I figured they out based on my research, but he was inaugural in the HBO stand-up comedy broadcast programs that it made, and this was amazing. Like the idea behind HBO was like, we can air Gone with the Wind, we can air George Carlin all in the same day.
Now, not to throw another name in there, but it's funny to me that people like Richard Pryor, who same time, very similar, but just didn't use those words, got no notice from the FCC. It's just...
Well, no, because he was, at the time, I mean, he would make jokes about like beating his wife, that was fine.
That was fine.
Or light yourself on fire, freebasing drugs.
Or his mom running the whorehouse that his mom worked at,
Yeah, they were contemporaries, man. Carlin finished behind Pryor for a Grammy in this time.
They're both. Lenny Bruce was a big influence on both of them, because I know a fair bit about Lenny Bruce, and I know that he was like the big influence for both of those guys, which are like a lot of people's 1 and 2 for top comedians ever.
Yeah, Scott, what were you saying?
Well, one of this is something not a lot of people know, is that the reason Pryor didn't get as much in trouble for that kind of stuff is because he always aired all of his stuff at 3 p.m.
Right after.
Yeah.
The family hours 2 to 3.
Kids were all in bed by then.
It was pretty amazing, the reach of the Supreme Court's decision here, and it did impact Carlin's career, but not necessarily negatively as well. Like, Carlin recovered from this and used it to his advantage, much like before when he'd been arrested at Wisconsin's Milwaukee Summerfest. Scott and Mike, what's up?
If anything, it falls under the no publicity is bad publicity. It's just free advertisement for his stuff. Everybody's like, oh, it's in trouble. Let's go see what it is.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely, to be honest with you, it helped him and in that regard. I mean, so one of the issues you run into in the comedy scene of that time is that certain people would get blacklisted from certain clubs because of the types of stuff they would talk about. And I had heard there were a few occasions where club owners would say, you cannot have this, we're not having this comic in the club. And then someone else would bring the comic in while the club owner wasn't there. But it's all because of, it's like, I understand, the club owner does not want that type of comedy in his club. But on
That's
the
what happened to Lenny Bruce.
Yeah.
He got blacklisted from like everywhere.
Yeah. But the bright side is that the places that were willing to showcase these artists that have now like the Purple Heart of, being arrested for their comedy, it definitely drove people to those shows.
Yeah, it's the whole like, oh man, this is so bad that the government's involved. I gotta see it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just that idea that this person has drawn up so much attention. He's got to be something worth seeing.
Oh yeah. You know, and to be honest with you, it's like they do. You see that a lot in other media as well. Like Rush Limbaugh would say, is like some people come to see me just because like they want to know what I'm going to say next.
Yeah,
You know,
it's just that like nowadays we would use things like trigger warning and stuff like that, but back then it wasn't, at least in the common lexicon, but similar. Like, oh, I want this guy to offend me. Let's go there.
Yeah, it's an amazing bit that led him there, that he had to stumble off and recover from. At the same time, addicted to cocaine, having heart attacks. He would have 3 total heart attacks in his lifetime. I want to see if I wrote the dates down, but I did not.
I got him. Hold on. I just saw this on.
Early on, it's like 74. I think might have been his second heart attack.
78, 82, and 91.
There he's. All right. So as the case is being decided that year, like not as, but that same year, he suffers a heart attack. His cocaine addiction is absolutely like in and out of control. Sometimes he quits and sometimes he's back on, but he was missing shows throughout this few years, and the Supreme Court case probably helps him level off a little bit, given some more legitimacy and fame. And he continues his awesome comedy career. Wrote a shitload of comedy specials.
Yeah.
He had 20 albums recorded. Scott?
Yeah, that's actually it's funny because that was going to be one something I definitely wanted to talk about when we decided on this topic. Was one of the main reasons, on top of the fact that he's a comedic genius, and especially like, you know, the social impact that he had on the nation. George Carlin did something that it was fairly unheard of until like within the last 20 years of comedy, which is that a lot of the comics back then is they would create their set, you know, over the course of time, and then they would find what jokes are their best, and then they would have like these tight, you know, times, but that they would continue using those same jokes over and over again for years. You know, Jerry Seinfeld would be an example that would come later, but Jerry Seinfeld, he did a 4-way interview called, it was on HBO. I'm sure I could find out what that was, but he did basically an hour-long podcast, if you will, with Ricky Gervais and Louis C.K. and Chris Rock. I think it was called Talking Funny. But the whole point of it is one of the things that they talked to him about was that Jerry Seinfeld has been using the same jokes for 30 years with very little changes here and there. But he's like, well, why would I ever change it? George Carlin, being an influencer of so many comedians, would record a special, like, you know, do all the prep work, plan out that he's going to be recording a special in about a year, do a special, throw out those jokes and never use them again, with the exception of his big ones like the 7 dirty words, which would come out as a track, like his filthy words or dirty words that he would use on a few albums. But generally speaking, he would throw everything out, which allowed him to talk about way more topics, way more in depth than you could if you were just continually doing the same jokes and, you know, you have this shield up in front of you. So, I mean, even looking at Carlin's Wikipedia page, I mean, you can see between 1972 and 1977, he recorded basically a special a year, where other people were taking 5 to 10 years before they were willing to do a special.
He did six in a 5-year period, which the big special that launched these 7 dirty words was Class Clown. That was 1972, and kind of mid transformation George. And then Occupation Fool, he was quoted as saying, quick side note, fool in that album is spelled with Foole, and he says in quotations in the James Sullivan book, says I spelled it with an E just to piss him off. Like he was doing these things with his career, start to finish, from the album to the stage, right? But the Filthy Words was recorded in Operation Fool. That was 1973. So like even before the court case, you know, he was riffing this language and riffing with language in Burns and Carlin, doing bits like the Indian Sergeant bit, which he's really famous for. Again, super racist, but it was notable for basically making fun of Native American naming conventions. And it played with the the faux seriousness of being bigoted. And he's using this over and over through his albums to be like, oh, I'm gonna mock you for being so uptight. And it worked. And that's probably some of his incredible charm, right?
Mm-hmm. And to be honest with you too, I mean, he had such an impact in the court case and everything else, just in the fact of, we now look back and go, man, that was crazy. Well, we only look back and say that was crazy because he clearly had an impact in how we've decided to consume media now, to allow for us to not have to go through all the censored channels that we see every day.
I'd say. I think he was, whether or not we like it, he was instrumental in helping FCC assert power and establish what is now known as the safe harbor laws. Those are basically the hours of, I think it's 6, maybe it's 8, like 06 to 0800, all the way till 2200. You cannot say shit, fuck, piss, cunt, cocksucker, blah, blah, on TV or the radio. But the compromise was after dark, right? You start seeing that come out. These are the shows after dark. These are the after hours, the late night crowd in TV. Because the FCC case, not to harp on that so much, but was key in separating the time frames, because apparently nothing's indecent after 10 p.m. It's like fine.
The
'cause
kiddies are in bed, so yeah, it doesn't
yes,
matter.
kids are
Oh,
asleep.
also, I remember that the broadcasters at the time started using the Carlin warning to let people coming onto their airwaves, so to speak, of what words they couldn't say. They would actually use his bit to like say, you can't say any of these words. So if it's in, take it out.
Yeah, there's a famous photograph at the WBAI recording booth it's probably on the Wikipedia too. I think I saw it there.
Yeah, it's like it has the 7 words listed and it says 7 FCC fines underneath it.
They make you have to look at it as you go into the recording booth. And I think that's probably a badge of honor for a place like WBAI, for the Pacifica.
Especially for somebody like Carlin, who is he took pride in his use of the language, so that something so, I don't know, air quotes, primitive would be what he's known for, is probably his best joke,
Yes. His best joke in terms of most impact, right?
Right.
High profile, cocaine addicted comic, probably didn't think he was going to end up in the Supreme Court by any means. But that bit sort of lived beyond him, or outlived him, or whatever, because it was his sort of masterpiece, whether or not he knew it when he was writing it. But it also spoke so much of his personality. Folks who knew George, like his nuns at the school, this year, 1973, same year, his mother is walking down the street and anecdotally writes about how his nuns came up to her and were like, "Isn't George's career going so great?"
That's awesome.
Mary Carlin, his mother's, she's like, "What do you mean? He's swearing. He's got long hair. He's smoking cigarettes." And they're like, "No, but he's really saying like it is." So
Man,
I like the idea of
visit this super progressive Catholic school.
I know, it's Corpus Christi, man. Them nuns.
Isn't that in Texas?
Yep. Yes.
It's like a
Texas, New York.
Catholic thing, though, right? Like,
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's Latin for body of Christ.
okay, gotcha. There you go.
I just love the idea that
my Catholic showing.
I just love the idea that she's like, well, but he's smoking cigarettes. Meanwhile, he's like snorting a line of cocaine off of a bathroom.
So much, dude. He did so much cocaine. He said in one of his interviews that what was crazy about the other drugs, he did LSD, peyote. He kind of sampled it all, the smorgasbord. He's like, but I'd run through those and I'd find my endpoint. He said, what cocaine is different. I found out quickly that I loved it, and I found out quickly that I could afford it. And it's like, I know I'm misquoting probably there, but the idea being, yeah, he could.
There, and I like it.
And he abused it to the point where he was like missing performances. I kind of brushed up on that before. He eventually came off of it and became sober, right?
But before that, he did order a couple of the psychoactive samplers.
Oh my man had like the briefcase in Fear and Loathing in his body. My man could do some drugs, but his sort of ability to consume matched his ability to produce this comedy. And like, here's some numbers for him. He did write 4 books, most of them being bits of his comedy and musings that made it into writing. Some of them never on stage, and um, he also had posthumous writings that were released by his family estate. Uh, but his first hardcover book was Brain Droppings. That was the title of that, released in 1997. And it sold 900,000 copies. It spent 40 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list in 1997. And just so you math lovers, a year has 52 of them. It's a solid portion of a year, where George Carlin in 1997, right, 24 years after he's already made history, he's crushing it as still popular.
Well, he also did his part to remain relevant too, releasing specials very frequently and then doing parts and cameos in movies. And I mean,
No, that's a really good point. I mean, he didn't stop working.
It's not like he released 7 Dirty Words and then he disappeared. He definitely is a working individual.
No, Mike, George Carlin is a monolith. Say it. No,
George Carlin is a monolith.
He really did amazing, varied work. Yeah, he acted. He was he had some like cool little info bit. He had a 1990s sitcom as a comic. Who'd have thought? It's like they all got together and did that. But the George Carlin show was one where he tested more of his like comic acting, screen acting, and it wasn't great. And he often like stumbled through some of those performances as awkward in the acting arena, as underprepared or sometimes overprepared, right? He was also a great writer. So like in the Hollywood writers' rooms of his own shows, they just dunk on him. They're like, "No, George, you don't understand comedy. We're doing a sitcom here. We're just like, could you?" And he would talk about that. It's like, fucking my fucking life, and I don't get to fucking talk about it, you know? Incredible talent, but someone who maybe found that disillusionment never left him. And in 1997, Brain Droppings comes out. I have to make sure the year is right, but very, very shortly thereafter, his wife Brenda dies of breast cancer in 1997. And this was a really tragic, time for sure. Through that grief, he doesn't stop performing. He just like takes breaks. And a year after the loss of his wife, kind of gets back out on the scene and gives a call to an old friend, who's going to become his second wife, Sally Wade. Yeah, so he even got to have 2 wives. How cool is that?
I don't know, Matt. How cool is that?
It's not.
But George Carlin's life, he did die in 2008 after, still being out on the comedy circuit. He had gone clean between the death of his wife and his own, and stopped doing drugs entirely. Talked about sobriety in his comedy and how it kind of elucidated him, but still kept the edge and all that.
He recorded a special called "I Kind of Like It When a Lot of People Die," which didn't see the light of day until much later, because the special was recorded over the course of 2 nights, September 9th and September 10th, 2001. Yeah, so that was kind of shelved, which is why there was a bit of a break between, him having his 1999 release, and then he had to do another one in Complaints and Grievances later, which I assume has a lot of the same material. But I would imagine if you have the title of it, I kind of like when a lot of people die, that you have to completely remove that portion of it. It probably takes up a big portion of that set. So
this is shortly after if I'm not mistaken, then that would be right after the "You Are All Diseased" special. That was 99, right? Yeah.
So wait, you're telling me that in 2008 his heart just wasn't in it anymore?
Damn.
I was, on the Wikipedia page, I was looking
at last cardiac event, I believe, that
under his death. It's like He had heart problems spanning 3 decades, and it lists the 3 heart attacks that we talked about earlier. An arrhythmia in 2003, an episode of heart failure in late 05, 2 angioplasties, and finally heart failure in 2008. Like, holy
Yeah,
cow.
that did him in.
Jesus.
Did him
Cocaine is
in.
a hell of a drug.
They pulled his heart out, and there was actually still a fresh rock of cocaine tucked inside.
It looked like a powder finish.
He made an incredible impact on comedy and society, no matter which way you shake it, though. George Carlin is like Scott and everyone you guys mentioned. Ask a comic their influences, and if George Carlin's comedy doesn't come up, it's kind of surprising, one way or the other, whether it's wit or bravery or bold swearing, just good fart jokes. He had great fart jokes.
Well, I mean, Dave Attell marks him down as, one of his biggest influences. And Dave Attell is, despite the fact that he's not as popular or mainstream in the regard of like Carlin, Pryor, the Mount Rushmore of comics, Dave Attell is easily the most influential comic to all the whole comedy scene as a whole. And yeah, like you said, you talk to any comic of all ranges, from like Louis C.K. to Bo Burnham to Jay Leno, even though their material doesn't match the type of comedy that Carlin did, watching Carlin in that space, like if you watch someone that's really good at their job do it, you kind of want to do it.
It's a beautiful thought. Do you guys have a favorite George Carlin bit or joke?
Oh, mine comes from his cameo role in the View Askew-universe when he is the hitchhiker in Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back and describes the unwritten rules of the road.
That's a copulation joke, I think.
It's if you don't have any money, you got to give them something.
One of his better acting. He calls that actually one of his least proud acting moments. That was documented in the Sullivan
I want
book.
to say that might have been, it's either that or Dogma was my first exposure to Carlin, and then it made me go look him up because I'm like, this guy's crazy.
Dogma was definitely my first exposure to him.
99. All right, Scott, this is probably more of a difficult question for you, but do you have like a favorite golden Carlin bit?
This is probably just me, but like I like his religion is bullshit.
Oh yeah,
bit.
that's good stuff.
There's two aspects that he does. Because this one's a little bit different, but he does go through the iconic bit is he goes through the 10 commandments and like gets them down to like 2 commandments. But there's like this part where he's talking about in the religion is bullshit bit where he's like, he goes, a god I could believe in, would be I could be a sun worshiper. Overnight I became a sun worshiper, actually. Well, not overnight because the sun's not out at night, but first thing that next morning, I became a sun worshiper.
He did a great religion bit that was not the sun worshiper one of my favorites, but I had an intimate connection to George Carlin as a child. That did not come out right, but I was
about to cancel George Carlin.
I was like beyond the grave, man. No, I was 9 years old when I was invited to a comedy theater in Cincinnati. My mom took my brother and me out to dinner, and she said it was going to be dinner and a show. And we finished dinner, Spaghetti Warehouse or some shit like that. Got into the theater, and it's like, tonight, George Carlin. And she's like, what's that? And she goes, oh, it's comedy. You're going to love it. My brother's 10 and I'm 9. And the warm-up bit was already kind of profane, and she was looking at us and kind of giggling once in a while. I think she was stoned. And then the lights lower fully, and it's fucking go time. And George Carlin walks out. I'm 9 years old, so it's 1998. His wife just died, right? And he comes out and he's strolling out on stage and he goes, look at you motherfuckers. That's his first words, and everyone's like loving it. And I'm 9 and I'm like surprised by this. He swore, oh my gosh, and he's mocking us and they're loving him. And then he launched into the bits. But my favorite ever, it's the place for my stuff bit. He talks about how you work so hard to buy a house, so you can fill it up with stuff. And the house really isn't a place where you live. It just becomes a place for your stuff. And then he, just like the religion bit, he reduces it to the point where all your stuff, if you ever go on vacation, it's still just another vacation. It's just another smaller place for your stuff. You know, it's a great bit, reduces it, mocks our sort of materialism, and makes us laugh about it.
And that's one thing Carlin really excelled at, was taking a big concept and just boiling it down to 2 or 3 key phrases. That was his magic touch, and I think it was his grasp of the language. He was able to like take the words that were in, like with the commandments. He would take one of the commandments and just look at the words and be like, well, this word is basically just this word, so we can strike that one for the record.
That's, yeah, I think what you're saying, Scott, and that's the bit, the one I was talking about too, that reduction and that slashing through euphemism. He's so keen on it.
Matt, did you have a favorite bit?
Oh, because I don't know any of his bits.
He's the only one who really did his job for this one.
I mean, like, honestly, I've seen him in a couple movies, and that's pretty much it.
The introduction of Buddy Jesus was Matt's
favorite. I mean, the thing that struck me, like, listening to all this right now, not having known any of it, and like from what I know about Lenny Bruce too, like Carlin kind of finished a little bit what Lenny Bruce started. Kind of feel like, as far as making profanity more mainstream, like just within the generation from my dad to me, like I couldn't even say sucks growing up because my dad considered that a curse word. Like I'd get in trouble if I said sucks. Now, like I fucking curse all the time, and like at first I felt bad about it, but now it's like not even a thing to me. Like I don't even understand why a curse word would make anybody mad. You know? Like maybe if you're like directing it straight at them as an insult, but like just as a word, like I don't understand why there's a word that can make you mad.
Yeah, why is asshole offensive and potato isn't?
Yeah, exactly. And like curse around my kids, and they curse sometimes, and like my mom will hear it and she's like, oh, you got to be careful. I'm like, why? Like I don't care if my kid says fuck. Like what does it matter? It's just a word.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Here's how a great Carlin relation, man. His mom, Mary Carlin, wrote in his yearbook as a younger man, I think the high school yearbooks, be yourself always, in all ways. Another mastery of the language, right? So later on, he has her on TV after he's become famous for saying shit, piss, tits, cunt, and all this. And he looks at her and he says, "Mother, eat your words." And you can see it. The camera pans to her eyes, and she's just like, "Oh, all right." The total surrender.
Wrecked.
I think the expression would be "fucked," maybe.
That's a nice little punctuation mark too, just to say that, you know, he was somebody that pushed for that. Now the general public, it's like profanity isn't nearly the thing it used to be.
Yeah, he was very responsible, famously now responsible for it. So if you didn't know, now you know. And I should shout out to my sources before we go too much farther, but I don't want to forget about him. I read a book here. It's called 7 Dirty Words. Imagine that. Subtitled The Life and Crimes of George Carlin. And that was written by James Sullivan. Got to use a legal brief, which is very verbose, and I'll put the title in the comments maybe. But beyond that, watched a lot of good YouTube documentaries. The A&E documentary came out in October of 2002, before he was even dead. And of course, Wikipedia and YouTube rabbit holes of free ripped off George Carlin content. Thank you, YouTube.
Well, with that in mind, this has been another episode of Uninformed Summary. You can follow all of us on Twitter, Matt at Matchroll20, Mike at DumbGinMaster, D-U-M-B. You can follow me at That One Loud Guy, and once again, you can follow Vinny at Ted Cruz.
Fighting the good fight. Thanks, Scott.
Yep. Thank you, guys. We'll see you guys next episode.
Next time.
I don't understand why you can't say cheeseburger.